Welcome to Bold Voices, Good Yarns. I'm your host, Ian Henzel. Behind every book lies an author's life story. So join me on an interactive journey as we step between the pages to explore how an author's life and their experiences have shaped the stories that we cherish and love. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe or a cocktail, and join me as we step between the pages. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ian Henzel, and I'm the host here. And today we have another great author. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe or a cocktail, because today we're going to be stepping between the pages of the life of author Richard Compson Sater. Hi, Richard.
Hello, Ian.
So Richard has a new book out, and his book is called Thirst. It's a great new love story and kind of a little bit untraditional from what you might think of as romance, because it's a romance that's challenged in some respects. One of the characters likes alcohol way too much and is denying his true self. And I would say it's a real men's love story with real men in it. So, Richard, let's jump into your life. Oh, and before we do, I want to remind everybody to please subscribe and follow us. So, Richard, can you share a little bit about your upbringing? I know very little about your early years and how you think that shaped your worldview.
My father worked his whole career for the Aluminum Company of America, and they moved him around quite a bit. By the time I was 9 years old, I had lived in 4 different states, and I was born in upstate New York. Then we moved to Cleveland, then Pittsburgh, then the East Tennessee area near Knoxville. Because we moved around so much, one of the things that I learned about myself was kind of to be independent. It was difficult to maintain friendships when we would be in a place only for a couple of years and then move on to someplace else. And so I kind of learned to be independent as a result of that. We were living in Tennessee when I started to wonder whether or not I might be gay. And at that time, in the early 70s, there really wasn't much I could turn to in the way of literature, resources of any kind, certainly no trusted advisors. I think I learned the most about homosexuality from Dear Abby. And one thing that I learned from her columns is that it wasn't really an asset at that time. And it seemed to cause people a lot of mix-up and pain. And so I decided it would be best to try to hide that. And maybe if I worked hard enough at it, it wouldn't become true.
Now, how old were you in the early 70s?
12, 13, 14.
So you were quite young.
Yeah.
And you were in Tennessee at the time?
Yes.
So there probably wasn't much. Did you ever go into libraries to look for material, or?
Most I could find, I remember checking the encyclopedias that I had access to at school, and we had the World Book at home. And again, I didn't find very much at that time that seemed very hopeful or positive to me. It seemed that it was more an aberration, and I think some of the terms that get thrown around by very religious people about being an abomination and such certainly colored my perception of what it could be.
And probably where you were growing up. I grew up in New York, and I did get books out of the library. Let me rephrase that. I didn't take the books home. I read them in the stacks, and I just remember very damaging books. One book in particular was called Growing Up Straight: How to Raise a Straight Child, and that one was scarring, I might say. So, and then there was Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex and Was Afraid to Ask, and that one was also a hideous book and probably responsible for destroying more than one life. So you were independent, you were moving around a lot. Did reading come into play? Were you an avid reader?
I was a very avid reader from the time I could read, probably in kindergarten or thereabouts. I was kind of a voracious reader. I would prefer a good book to almost anything that I could do outdoors. I wasn't very athletic as a kid. Certainly as I got older into junior high and high school, sports being the emphasis at the junior high and high school where I attended, I had no real interest in sports. I really started diving into books. And I decided probably when I was about 14 or 15 that I would limit my reading to the classics. And so I started kind of grounding myself in reading Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, Joseph Conrad, 1984, Brave New World, all different kinds of stuff. But I limited myself to the classics of literature because I thought I owed it to myself to be well read. And I wanted to be able to brag, perhaps, that I had read Henry James and some of these authors that are probably not as widely read now as they used to be. And a good book was always a refuge for me. I think from the time I was a toddler anyway, my dad or my mom used to read to me and my two sisters at night before bed. And the kinds of books that they read to us were the children's classics, Black Beauty, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Heidi was one, and several others like that along those same lines. That Treasure Island was another one. And they would read a chapter each night, and we would, even long after we could read ourselves, until we were maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, they would still read to us at bedtime. And it was such a marvelous introduction to me, and I think to my sisters as well as kids, having this storytelling and hanging on to it and read one more chapter so we can find out what's going to happen. And I think I carried that with me even today. If I get involved in a good book, I don't want to do anything but keep reading.
It's always remarkable because in the authors I've interviewed and people I talk to, those people that were read to as children, you can kind of see when they start talking about it, them going back in time, and that they're very warm moments with very fond memories. Was there any writer that particularly influenced you, or writers?
I think the first writer who I would say was an influence on me when I started writing fiction was William Faulkner, of all people. I can remember reading some Faulkner when I was in high school for book reports. And my first crack at Sound and the Fury, I made it about 100 pages in, and then I gave up. But I found some other Faulkner that I could read that I really enjoyed. Sanctuary was one of the novels that is still one of my favorite Faulkner novels. But what I loved about William Faulkner's writing was, I think you can kind of sum it up in a quote that one of my professors shared with me. He said, Faulkner said, "Don't read my books to understand them, read for the pleasure of reading." And that kind of made it okay for me not to understand every single thing that was going on in Faulkner's prose. And it just let me get lost in the words and the sentences that sometimes would go on for pages without punctuation, without paragraph breaks. And I attempted to emulate that. Another book I read when I was about 18 was A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. And that also kind of opened a door for me. And when, as a freshman in college, I took my first creative writing class, I think I consciously was trying to ape Joyce and Faulkner with convoluted text and curious punctuation and capitalization and things like that. And early on, it kind of wowed my professors. I don't know if they had seen anybody like me, as perhaps precocious as I was. But later on, as I became a junior and senior, and I was still actively pursuing my creative writing bachelor's degree, I bumped into teachers who didn't like that style at all. And they said, "What are you trying to hide? Just tell your story." And it took me a long, long time to find a style that I felt was my own, that wasn't really loosely based on anybody else. But I think my first great influence, I'd have to pick Paul.
So you've had, and it's interesting, sometimes I wonder if in the writing process, the reader gets lost, that there's a consumer, if you will, to what's being written, and that sometimes the reader gets lost in that, that there's somebody who has to read that and interpret it. And also that people don't necessarily sit and read something cover to cover. They're picking it up, putting it down. So I've often wondered about that. Now, your life and your career has been very varied, to say the least. I know that you said you worked in a bookstore, you were a blind salesman, and you were also in the military. How long were you in the military, and what did you do?
I was in the Air Force for 24 years. I did retire with full benefits and everything from the Air Force back in 2011. Initially, I enlisted. I was an enlisted man for 3 years, a carpenter bricklayer of all things. I was given the opportunity at about 2.5 years to apply for a commission, and I was a success in that. I cross-trained into public relations, which meant that I was able to spend most of my military career as a photojournalist, which I absolutely loved to do. I was telling the Air Force story. I got all over the world. I spent some of the happiest years of my Air Force career assigned to a unit that flew a cargo plane. And we went to almost every continent. And I got to follow along and document the missions, take photos, write them up when we got home. And I found that especially rewarding because as a young gay man, when I enlisted in the military, this was even before Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the middle 80s. And they could ask. And so the recruiter asks point blank, "Are you a homosexual?" And I had to make the decision to say, "No, I am not." Because if I had said yes or said I wasn't sure, they wouldn't have accepted me as a recruit. And so I had to tell that lie that no, I'm not a homosexual. In the I guess, early 90s when Clinton was president, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy came in. By then I was an officer, but I was also expected that Don't Ask, Don't Tell would be a short-term policy en route to gay people being able to serve openly. But it turned out it stuck around for 15 years. And so I ended up having to spend my entire career in the military, and that was very tricky. I really had to push that back. I had several deep and serious crushes on some male coworkers. In some cases, people that I was assigned to in the same unit. In some cases, people that I was deployed with when I was overseas in Afghanistan or Bosnia, Iraq, the Philippines. And I had to just kind of deal with that and push it aside because I had a job to do and I couldn't put the job at risk by making my feelings known. It was a real challenge for me to have to deal with that.
Was that the inspiration for your novel, Rank?
That was very much the inspiration for Rank. I had a very serious crush on a senior officer, and I got to wondering what if. And I started writing what I assumed would be a short story about a young officer who falls in love with a senior officer. And it got longer and longer and longer. It got to 25 pages and then 50 and then 80. And I thought, I might have a novel. And eventually I did. I worked hard on.
Did you write that while you were in the military or after you retired?
I started writing Rank while I was in Afghanistan. We were working 7 days a week, probably 12 to 14 hours a day. And at the end of the day, I would be back in my room, which I shared with several other airmen. And I needed something to do that would allow me to decompress a little bit. I needed to lose myself in something that didn't have to take me out of where I was. And so I started working on this story, and I'd get back to my room and I'd write for an hour or an hour and a half before I went to bed, and then get up and do the same thing over again. And it helped. It helped me get through that deployment.
And so one of the things I've also heard, and so that's a remarkable story. And by the way, Rank is available from Bold Strokes Press. His new novel, Thirst, is available from Rattling Good Yarns Press. Do you think there's a synergy? So as a photojournalist, you were taking photographs and telling as a storyteller, a visual storyteller. Do you think there's a synergy between visual storytelling and storytelling through the written word? Do you think there's a similar part of your brain that you use? I'm kind of curious about that relationship.
There's a cliche that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And as a photographer, my aim was to try to find that one picture that would be worth 1,000 words. The one that almost would not even need a caption because it was so clear what was happening in the picture. One of the things that as a writer that I find myself struggling with a little bit is capturing some of those details that are so easy to show in a photograph. If you take a picture of a room, you can see the kind of furniture, the decor. You can determine furniture from the 70s. There's a reproduction of a Van Gogh on the wall. And you can see that stuff without having to describe it. In a novel, the challenge is, okay, I have to put my characters in this scene. What does the reader need to know about this room? What does the reader know about what these characters are wearing, or what they're eating, or what they're doing while they're conversing? And the challenge for me as a writer is how to create that scene. I feel that I'm strongest with dialogue, but if you just have dialogue, then you're writing a play.
I found that with, when editing books, and especially with new authors or some of the submissions I've seen, is that sometimes I think authors don't understand that they're not only writing the screenplay, the dialogue, they are the cinematographer, they're the set designer, they're the film editor, and they're the director. When you see a play or a movie, all of that is being done by a collaborative effort of several people coming together in their talents. And I remember in one book I had worked on, the character was visiting a friend and the hospital had AIDS, and the character walked in to the hospital room. And I asked the author, would the character hesitate? Would they just walk in? Would they stand at the door and afraid to walk into, the reader can't see that. The reader can only see what the author gives them to see. So it's a little more complex because you have to fill all those roles. And I think sometimes the best books are the ones that, where you're watching the movie in your head. And that's all a result of the author. Do you think about that kind of thing when you're writing?
I think that's a beautiful analogy that you made, that you're the dialogue coach, and you're the set designer, and you're the director, and you're the editor, and all that. I think because you're juggling all of those balls when you're writing and determining exactly how do I make this movie so that the person reading the story can picture this in his or her head. And that's, to me, that's the perfect analogy for it. It's something that I think about. I think it's always in the back of my mind as
I want to do a pivot now. And I'm going to ask you the question that some of the folks on our show love, some dread. We're talking about these worlds and these movies that are created through literature. So if you could live in a book, what book would you live in? Now, your favorite book might be, I don't know, The Pit and the Pendulum or story, but would you want to live in it? If you could live in a book, what book would you live in, and why?
That's a wonderful question. And I have a multi-part answer, because it would depend. If I would merely be a character in a world, I think my first choice would be Roughing It by Mark Twain, which is a book that he wrote as a bachelor exploring the Old West. And I can just imagine how much fun it would be to be pals with Mark Twain. And I'm sure that,
Who was kind of sexy if you've seen him without his shirt on.
I think Mark Twain is very sexy. And I have a feeling that if he and I were palling around the Old West, we would probably share a bedroll. If I had the capacity to affect the lives of the characters within the novel, I would choose To Kill a Mockingbird, by Harper Lee, because I think Atticus Finch is one of the most beautiful characters in literature. And I think he would be a gentle, courteous, and passionate lover.
So another character or a character you wouldn't mind getting it on with.
Right. I would have to admit that. But I would say, if it was just a world that I wanted to inhabit, and I know I'm not the first to say this, I would pick Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City, because I can't imagine being a young man in a welcoming community that was so open to all kinds of sexuality, all varieties of gender and experience, and to have that welcoming community. I can't imagine what kind of man I would be today if I had had that opportunity at that age. as say an 18, 20-year-old man if I had had the opportunity to be in that kind of a wealth.
You're not the first author to have suggested that book, and I can definitely see it. Do you think, in imagining who you might have been, do you think you would have been writing? I mean, do you think that it's all of our experience makes us? Do you think had it been that welcoming world, do you think, Richard, you'd be the Richard you are now, or do you think you'd be radically different?
I have a suspicion that I might not be alive because of coming of age in the age of AIDS. Had I been in a more permissive environment, had I not been in the military, I have a feeling I might not have made it through that. I did get as I mentioned, I got my bachelor's degree and a master's degree in creative writing, but it was many years after that I felt confident enough to want to write fiction. And I know that I wouldn't be the man I am today without the experiences that I've had.
Interesting. Richard, I want to thank you for being on our show once again. We've been in conversation with Richard Compson Sater, and his new novel is Thirst. That's coming out from Rattling Good Yarns Press. There will be links to Richard's books in the show notes and the description for this show. Once again, please don't forget to follow and subscribe to us. And Richard, I want to thank you for being here on Bold Voices, Good Yarns, and I hope that maybe we'll see you back on here again in the future.
Thank you, Ian. This has been a wonderful opportunity. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everyone. You've been listening to Bold Voices, Good Yarns, brought to you by Rattling Good Yarns Press. Subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube, and follow us on social media. Search for Rattling Good Yarns Press. Also, visit our website at rattlinggoodyarns.com, where you can find great reads and interesting articles about the world of books. See you soon!